This video was funded by my amazing Patreons. If you would like to have access to the behind the scenes, see the videos early, and influence the creation, please feel free to check the link below. In the previous episode of Beyond the Dark, we discussed the birth and rise of one of the most feared women of the medieval period, Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Yet many questions still remain, the most prominent being, was Elizabeth Bathory a sadistic monster like the stories suggest, or was she merely a puppet to a conspiracy leading to the highest echelons of noble society? Before we can answer, we must tell the account of Elizabeth's supposed actions and atrocities. In the villages below Čachtice Castle, a foul rumour is spreading like a miasma about her ladyship and her supposed circle. The villagers are feeling the oppressive weight of helplessness and utter terror as during this time, the peasants are unable to bring any charges against the upper class. And if the rumours of a sick and twisted acts taking place in the darkest bowels and endless corridors are true, then their children are merely lambs to the slaughter. But what exactly is taking place in the imposing castle? According to the accounts running rampant from the villagers and some supposed escapees, the typical scenario was this. A servant girl may simply neglect or make a mistake in their duties, from either missing a stain during their cleaning or wasting some food. In these moments, if they were able, they could cover it up and breathe a sigh of relief. But sadly, that wasn't always the case. If a mistake was made in the presence of one of the five, the horrors would begin. Elizabeth, fixing an evil stare on the girl, would begin to demean and berate her until the girl is at the height of her emotional state. Only at this point is the young servant severely beaten, but that is never enough for her ladyship. For some time, she has grown fond of using two specific tools to inflict excruciating pain: sewing needles and a pair of scissors. The servant would be chained, stripped, and repeatedly punctured, and if the Countess wanted to cause as much pain as possible, which was quite normally the case, it'd be jammed into the soft, tender flesh, right under the fingernails. One event that was later retold was that Elizabeth, in a fit of rage, rammed a sewing needle into a young girl's finger. As she cowered in excruciating agony, begging for her ladyship's mercy, Elizabeth declared, "If it hurts the whore, then she can pull it out." When the young girl did, Elizabeth proceeded to sever the girl's fingers. It is not known if this girl survived to tell her tale, or if it was later retold by one of the five. It's 1601, and Elizabeth, over the course of a couple of years, has managed to conjure up a multitude of rather unique punishments for her servants. But before she can fully commit to her new dark desires, Ference returns home, and he is not well. A war injury has led to a serious infection into his legs, and his health is slowly declining. Now mostly bedbound, he is now a mere husk of what he used to be, a valiant soldier reduced to a ghost in a mortal shell. It doesn't take long for him to learn of his wife's exploits, and to everyone's surprise, he is rather supportive, if not proud, of her actions. But considering Ference gained a reputation for dancing with the remains of his fallen enemies, and even kicking their heads into the opposing forces, it really shouldn't have been a shock. Despite previously telling her to never kill the servants, Ference now joins in on the torture, and the couple are reunited in the macabre Crimson Court. He instructs and tutors Elizabeth with further brutal acts he deployed on the battlefield, and even tells his dear wife to put oil-soaked paper between the toes of any victims potentially playing dead after their sessions, and light them on fire. With each passing week, the servants come and go as the bodies begin to pile. The sadistic circle's hunger is insatiable as they slowly cut down the peasant population, and the local priest is called upon time and time again to perform funeral rites as they claim the girls died from cholera. But the priest is well aware of the rumours. It is recorded that on one of these visits, no longer being able to hide his suspicions, he pulls her ladyship aside and says, "Our grace should not have acted so because it offends the Lord, and will be punished if we do not complain to you and criticize your grace. And in order to confirm that my words are true, we need only exhume the body, and you'll find that the marks identify the way in which death occurred. Elizabeth's fury at the accusation is biblical. Being utterly disgusted by the priest, she threatens that she has powerful relatives who will not tolerate such talk, and if the priest values his reputation, even more so his life, he should hold his tongue. It's now a cold January morning, and a sweet lingering fragrance of wild tulips floats into the bedchambers of Čachtice Castle. However, their saccharine smell is being poisoned and corrupted by the stench of rotting flesh and pus. After 2 years of fighting the infection, Ference has been seized by a fever and is near death. With him is a close friend by the name of György Thurzó, who he met at the Battle of Esztergom. Once being a strong soldier, now a Hungarian magnate, Ference pleads that he takes care of his wife and see that no troubles plague her in the future. György takes the hand of his dying friend and swears that he shall protect Elizabeth with his honor. And with that, as the morning dawn begins to break, Ference falls into the eternal slumber of death. With the loss of her soulmate, Elizabeth is overwhelmed with grief and descends into utter anguish and depravity. The castle becomes a ghastly and almost nightmarish depiction of violence on a scale of near biblical proportions. During one altercation, Elizabeth bites into a young servant's face, tearing muscle from bone and disfiguring the girl before beating her to a bloody pulp. Many are locked in their rooms, their bodies becoming emaciated from starvation. Some are beaten to an inch of their lives, their bones broken and bodies violated, before being thrown from the castle walls. Girls are stripped and chained outside in the freezing cold of the harsh Hungarian winters to either be eaten by wolves or perish from exposure. One emaciated girl was even brought out of her room, which had been more turned into a tomb, and after days of starvation, she was forced to remove a pound of her own flesh, cook it, and devour it in front of the Countess. As Elizabeth's obsession continues to escalate, so does her dark fascination with blood. The story goes that during one of her routine beatings, some blood smeared across her face, and when wiped away, her skin immediately looks younger and more beautiful. The servants would later claim that during their cleaning duties they could lift handfuls of claret out of the bedsheets, while others claimed she would regularly bathe in it, thus the term bloodbath. However, these stories, much like with the Roman Emperor Caligula, came long after Elizabeth's death and were adopted into folklore. After the near-endless nights of horrors taking place in the labyrinthian corridors and chambers, Elizabeth begins running out of unwilling subjects in the castle. She tells Fisco and a woman by the name of Katalin to begin abducting peasant girls in the surrounding villages. Instead of dragging them to the castle by force, Fisco and Katalin instead lure the girls under false pretenses. However, the young woman Katalin is considered to be the least cruel of the group, as she tries to sneak food to the servants and even attempts to help some escape, but more often than not gets caught and severely punished for showing kindness. But more disturbingly, from time to time, Katalin and Fisco don't have to lure the girls at all, as parents are willing to hand over their children to the Countess for a measly sum. Once the girls arrive and start attending their duties, it doesn't take long for them to disappear and their position once again to become vacant. The vicious circle continues year after year until in 1609, Elizabeth's advisor Anna Darvolja drops to the floor and dies of a stroke. This is the first in many downfalls for Elizabeth, because around the same time, her debts to the kingdom start to become a serious financial issue. With all of her children now grown and married, she is isolated, alone, and desperate. It's still not entirely known why, but some believe the suggestion may have come from Anna Darvolja prior to her death, but Elizabeth decides she needs to find a better class of victim. It is speculated that she believed the richer blood would not only sustain her youth, but bring fortune to her struggling estate. So she makes a decision to open a finishing school for young noble women. To her mind, it would be the perfect cover for her to continue her sadistic acts, but now with a much higher caliber of victim, while at the same time she can charge the parents attendance fees, thus helping her financial woes. It is because of this mindset Elizabeth has unknowingly started her own downfall. The doors to Čachtice Castle now open to young noble girls learning the social graces of the upper class. Elizabeth tutors them on how to cultivate their etiquette for entry into the highest echelons of noble society. However, when Elizabeth begins to have private lessons with certain students, the girls begin to disappear. But this time, the parents come looking. Elizabeth, knowing that the parents have the ability to charge her with the disappearances, begins making up excuses for their missing daughters. One of the most peculiar stories she gave is that apparently one of the girls had supposedly succumbed to madness, and in a fit of pure insanity had brutally cut down and slaughtered the others. Of course, with her reputation, no one was convinced. Thankfully, due to their social standing, the parents had the ability to appeal to the king, Matthias II. Upon hearing of the horrors taking place at Čachtice Castle, he decided to investigate and sent his highest-ranking representative. That representative is György Thurzó, the same man who promised to protect Elizabeth, but his loyalty to the king is far stronger than that of an old friend. But being a man of his word, it has left him in a rather tough predicament. He begins to interview witnesses from the surrounding villages as well as some supposed escapees. He soon has dozens of people who are willing to testify about the Countess's depraved acts. But where they admitted to seeing blood-drenched walls, hearing horrific screams, and even witnessing an ever-expanding cemetery in the castle's courtyard, none of them actually saw the supposed torture and murder of the servants. Now armed with a testimony, Thurzó is entirely convinced of Elizabeth's guilt, yet the weight on his shoulders bears down upon him after the promise he made to Ference, so he decides to write to Elizabeth's relatives asking for advice. Rather bizarrely, a secret arrangement is reached by the two parties. He is allowed to complete his investigation and look for further evidence of Elizabeth's crimes, but she must never be brought to trial, but instead go directly to prison without the embarrassment to the family. What makes this so peculiar is that none of Elizabeth's relatives attempt to defend her nor claim she is innocent, and it just so happens that her wealth wouldn't be seized by the empire, but instead given back to the Bathory family, as long as there's no trial. It's December of 1610, and the proverbial noose is beginning to snake itself around Elizabeth's neck like coarse black vine. György Thurzó believes he has more than enough evidence to finally have Elizabeth Bathory and her depraved accomplices imprisoned and bring an end to their reign of terror. But before he can finally have them arrested, he and King Matthias II are invited to dine at the castle for a night of succulent food and exquisite entertainment. Upon their arrival, Elizabeth is clearly nervous of having to host for the two most important people in the kingdom, and of course, the ones who will judge her freedom. However, she manages to act as the perfect hostess. As the night goes on, Elizabeth and company enjoy their food and the wine flows. But when the men are served their dessert, they notice something rather strange. After the first bite, the two men begin to feel rather sick. It is not known if Elizabeth did in fact try to poison them both, but either way, the two men quickly say their goodbyes and flee the castle. Sometime later, on New Year's Eve, Thurzó returns with a garrison of armed soldiers and prepares for the arrest of Elizabeth Bathory. However, to their surprise, she meets them at the castle entrance with her lady steward, who begins to cast a supposed protective spell designed to keep the countess safe and bring an excruciating death to Thurzó. But obviously, it doesn't work. Thurzó and his men storm the castle, where they apparently were greeted to the vision of a mutilated body near the doorway and two more inside the castle. Once inside, the garrison hears the sound of screaming coming from the deepest depths of the castle. Upon inspection, they find the other members of the circle in the act of torture. It is unclear whether Thurzó physically caught Elizabeth in the act. However, with this hard evidence, he has her taken into custody. She immediately claims her innocence, blaming everything on her servants. However, Thurzó remains unconvinced, and he throws Elizabeth into her own dungeon. In the end, 306 people testify against the Countess, including the members of her sadistic circle, incriminating themselves in the process. But what has separated historians on their claims is the fact their confessions were a product of torture, as Ilona Joe and Dorka had their fingers torn out by iron tongs before they confessed. The final count is still unknown, but the estimate given is between 80 and 650 servants lost their lives to the group. It's now January of 1611. Elizabeth Bathory's accomplices are put on trial with scores of witnesses and even some surviving victims taking the stand to tell the horrors that took place in the castle. The bodies are exhumed from the mass grave from the castle courtyard, and the judges are shown the damages left behind as evidence to support Thurzo's claims. By the end, the death sentences are handed down to Ilona Joe, Dorka, and Fizko. The two women are tortured and thrown onto a bonfire. Fizko is spared from torture due to his youth, but instead he is beheaded and then burned. And Catalin is the only one not put to death due to her acts of kindness, but instead given life imprisonment. Keeping his word, Thurzo makes sure Elizabeth doesn't stand trial, but instead she is also sentenced to life imprisonment in her own castle, confined in one of the dungeons which had been the scene of some of her atrocities. Over the years, the only visitors she gets are priests and Thurzo, who after her imprisonment was awarded the title of Palpatine of Hungary, and with his new power and riches began building Lutheran churches and guilds in his lands. No matter how hard they try, Elizabeth never confesses to her crimes and continues to insist that it was her assistants who were the real monsters. When a priest challenged her as to why she didn't order them to stop, she claims that she feared for her life. On August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth Bathory complains to a guard that her hands were feeling cold. The guard tells her to go and lie down and get some sleep. And that night, the infamous Blood Countess dies. Her body was later buried in the church cemetery below Čachtice Castle, but the villagers flew into an outrage and demanded she be moved. The body was exhumed and taken to the Bathory family crypt. However, when the crypt was opened in 1995, her body was nowhere to be found. Thank you all so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed the episode. I've been Mr. Blank, and you've been watching Beyond the Dark.